At 9 o'clock on the morning of January 14, 1945, Lieutenant Wilhelm Dege walked out of a wooden hut on the northern coast of Nordostlandet into a darkness that had not lifted in 11 weeks to read the sky. He could not see the sky. There was no sky to see. The sun had set in late October and would not rise again until February. What Dege read instead were instruments: a barometer, a thermometer mounted away from the hut, an anemometer turning somewhere in the black above him, a hygrometer measuring moisture in air that was minus 38 degrees Celsius. He read the numbers by the light of a shielded lamp. He carried them back inside. His radio operator encoded them into a 5-figure cipher and transmitted them on a precise schedule to a German naval command post in occupied Norway, 1,200 kilometers to the south. A column of numbers: temperature, pressure, wind speed, wind direction, cloud. That was the entire war being fought on that rock, 1,050 kilometers from the North Pole. 11 men, no enemy in sight, no enemy within 600 kilometers. No shot would be fired in anger at Dege's position for the entire duration of his deployment. And yet, the numbers he transmitted from that darkness were, in their own quiet way, among the most strategically valuable information the German military possessed, because of one fact that governs everything that follows. In the North Atlantic, weather moves from west to east. The storm that will close the English Channel on Tuesday is forming over the Labrador Sea on Saturday. The clear window that will open over Normandy at dawn is being born tonight over the empty ice of Greenland. To know what Europe's sky will do tomorrow, you must read the Arctic's sky today. The future arrives from the west, and whoever owns the west owns the future. This is not the story of the beaches of Normandy. That story is well known. This is the story of the war that was fought to make that morning possible. A war fought in total darkness, in temperatures that killed, on islands with no names anyone in Berlin or London could pronounce, over the one thing no army can manufacture, conquer, or command. This is the story of the weather war. And it is the strangest war the 20th century produced. To understand why 11 men were freezing on Nordostlandet, you have to understand what happened to weather forecasting in September 1939. Before the war, weather was a shared resource. Meteorological stations across Europe, North America, and the Atlantic exchanged their observations openly every few hours over public radio frequencies. A forecaster in Berlin could read the conditions in Iceland, in Greenland, in Canada, in Ireland, and assemble a picture of what was coming. The atmosphere belonged to everyone because the atmosphere belonged to no one. The war ended that. The moment the fighting began, weather data became a weapon, and weapons are not shared. The Allied nations stopped broadcasting. They encrypted their observations. They cut Germany off from the entire western and northern half of the picture. By 1941, German forecasters trying to predict the weather over Europe were working with a map that had a vast hole torn out of its left side, the exact side the weather came from. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a structural disadvantage that touched everything. U-boats needed to know where the storms were before they sailed into the Atlantic to hunt convoys. The Luftwaffe needed to know whether a bombing raid over Britain would arrive to find clear skies or fog. The Kriegsmarine needed to time its movements around weather it could no longer see coming. An army that cannot predict the weather is an army fighting half-blind, and Germany, after 1941, was fighting the Atlantic half-blind. The Allies had the opposite problem, which is to say they had no problem at all. They controlled the upstream stations, the network across Canada, Greenland, and Iceland, plus weather ships anchored in the open ocean and reconnaissance flights ranging far out over the North Atlantic. They could see the weather being born in the west and watch it travel east toward Europe. They held the source. Germany held the mouth of the river and could only guess what was coming downstream. So Germany did the only thing it could do. If it could not read the Allied stations, it would build its own. in the loneliest, coldest, most inaccessible places on Earth, the places the weather came from. Greenland, Svalbard, Bear Island, Franz Josef Land, the Norwegian Arctic, and, on one extraordinary occasion, the coast of North America itself. It became a sprawling, secret network. The Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe between them planted manned stations on Arctic coasts and seeded the ice with automatic transmitters, the Siemens-built WFL series, of which more than 20 were produced, machines designed to broadcast weather for months with no human present at all. The stakes ran through the whole Northern War. The same Arctic weather that German forecasters were desperate to see governed the convoys grinding through to the Soviet Union at Murmansk and Archangel, the U-boat wolf packs waiting for them, the Luftwaffe raids flown from northern Norway, and the timing of every major operation in the European theatre. To control the weather report was to gain a few hours or a few days head start on all of it, and a few days in this war were worth dying for. This was the secret weather war. It was fought by tiny groups of men, meteorologists, radio operators, a handful of soldiers to guard them, landed by submarine or trawler on Arctic coasts, ordered to survive the polar winter and transmit numbers. It was hunted by equally small groups of men on the other side, dog sled patrols, Coast Guard cutters, long-range bombers, ordered to find the stations and destroy them. There were no front lines. There were no armies, there was only the ice, the darkness, and the numbers. And the numbers mattered more than almost anyone fighting the visible war ever understood. The first major German weather station in the Western Arctic was put ashore on the east coast of Greenland on August 22, 1942. It arrived aboard a converted fishing steamer named the Saxon, which had sailed from Tromsø in occupied Norway carrying 17 men. The expedition's meteorologists were led by Dr. Gottfried Weiss, who had personally scouted the coast a month earlier on a reconnaissance flight and identified a stretch of Greenland's northeast shore around 75 degrees north as ideal. Remote, uninhabited, far from anything. The military commander of the expedition was a naval lieutenant named Hermann Ritter, an Austrian, by most accounts not a committed Nazi, a man with little enthusiasm for the mission he had been handed. Ritter chose a wintering site at Hansa Bay on Sabine Island. The station was codenamed Holzauge. The men unloaded their equipment, built their shelter, established their radio link to Germany, and settled in for the long Greenland winter, transmitting their weather observations into the dark. For nearly 7 months, it worked perfectly. Holzauge sat undiscovered on its frozen island and fed the German war machine a steady stream of Arctic weather data, the precious upstream readings that German forecasters could get nowhere else. But Hermann Ritter had a problem, and he knew it. His station was roughly 70 miles from a small Allied outpost called Eskimones, and Eskimones was the home base of the most unusual military unit of the entire war. The Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol had been established in 1941 for exactly one purpose: to watch this coast for German activity. It was not an army unit, it was barely a unit at all. It consisted of perhaps 15 men, Danish police officers and Danish, Norwegian and Greenlandic fur trappers, men who had lived in northeast Greenland for years, who knew the ice and the fjords and the weather the way Ritter's men never could. They traveled by dog sled across hundreds of kilometers of empty Arctic coastline. They were led by a Dane named Ib Poulsen. They were, by any conventional military measure, almost nothing. A scattering of hunters with rifles and dogs. But they knew the country. And in the Arctic, the man who knows the country holds every advantage that matters. This was the same lesson the Soviet army had learned in the forests of Finland 3 winters earlier, and it was about to be taught again on ice. On the 11th of March 1943, a sledge patrol team came across the Holzauge station by accident. They had not been hunting it. They had stumbled onto it, sled tracks, structures, evidence of men where no men should be. The Germans saw them too, And the Germans understood instantly what discovery meant. Their 7 months of secrecy were over, and unless they acted, the station was finished. The Germans gave chase across the ice. The Sledge patrol team, hopelessly outgunned, had to abandon their equipment and even their dog teams and run. They made it back to Eskimones to warn the others. Ib Poulsen radioed the discovery to the Greenland authorities and asked for automatic weapons and orders. 2 days later, on the 13th of March, the war in the Arctic claimed the only life the Sledge patrol would lose in the entire conflict. As the Germans moved through the area, they encountered a patroller named Eli Knudsen, a Danish corporal near a place called Sandodden. They opened fire and killed him. 2 other patrol members were captured. 1 death. In a theatre the size of Western Europe, across years of war, the Allied side of the Greenland weather war cost exactly 1 man his life. But that 1 death changed the character of everything. These men had been observers, hunters, watchers. Now they had a casualty and a war. The German raiders pressed their advantage. On the 25th of March, they reached Eskimones itself and burned the patrol's headquarters to the ground. The men who were there escaped into the cold. The survivors regrouped and made a journey of roughly 600 kilometers south to the settlement of Scoresby-Sund, hauling the position of the German station with them as the most valuable cargo in Greenland. And then the strangest administrative act of the war took place. The governor of Greenland, Eske Brun, understood that his sled hunters were now combatants, and that if they were captured fighting out of uniform, they could be shot as bandits rather than treated as soldiers. So he formally made them an army. He gave them military rank. He issued them armbands in red, white, and blue. With that stroke of a pen, roughly 15 trappers and policemen became the smallest official army of the Second World War, the Greenland Army, and they went back onto the ice to finish the job. They did not have to finish it alone. One of the 2 captured patrollers managed to escape his German captors and, in a reversal almost too neat to believe, tracked down and captured Lieutenant Hermann Ritter himself, hauling the German commander back across the ice on a sled through sub-zero storms to be handed over to the Americans. Meanwhile, the location the patrol had carried south did its work. On the 25th of May, 1943, 4-engine American B-24 Liberator bombers flying from bases in Iceland under the command of Colonel Bernt Balchen, a Norwegian-American polar aviator who knew the Arctic as well as any pilot alive, found Hansa Bay and bombed the Holzhauer station. They destroyed its structures and, critically, its meteorological equipment. No Germans were killed in the raid, but the station's purpose was over. It could no longer report weather, and weather was the only reason it existed. The surviving Germans were evacuated by seaplane, lifted off the ice in 2 flights in June 1943, and the first great German weather station in Greenland was finished. For their part in ending it, 3 members of the Sledge Patrol, Ib Poulsen, the man who had captured Ritter, and Eli Knudsen, were awarded the American Legion of Merit. Knudsen received it posthumously. Germany would try again on the Greenland coast almost immediately. A second station, codenamed Basgeiger, was established at the northern tip of nearby Shannon Island for the following winter, though the expedition began badly, wrecking its own ship, the Coburg, against the Shannon coast in the process of landing. Basgeiger survived under brutal conditions for roughly 9 months, feeding Germany the same precious upstream data until a fresh clash with the Sledge Patrol gave away its position, and it too was evacuated by air in April 1944. For his part in the action against that station, another patroller, Niels Ove Jensen, received the same American decoration his comrades had earned at Sabine Island. Further German attempts on the Greenland coast in the autumn of 1944 were intercepted by the US Coast Guard before the stations could even be built. The weather war in Greenland never stopped, but Holzhauer had revealed its essential shape: tiny stations, vast distances, a handful of men who knew the ice hunting a handful of men who did not, and a single death standing in for an entire campaign. And then, in the autumn of 1943, the weather war did something no one in Canada or the United States imagined possible. It came to North America. On September 18, 1943, the German submarine U-537 left the port of Kiel under the command of Kapitänleutnant Peter Schroe, made a brief stop in occupied Norway, and headed out into the western North Atlantic on a mission unlike any other U-boat patrol of the war. She was not hunting ships. She was carrying a machine. The machine was called Wetterfunkgerätland. Number 26, automatic land-based weather transmitter, the sixth in a series of 21 built by Siemens. Its crew called it Kurt. It was, for 1943, a remarkable piece of engineering. A cluster of instruments, a 150-watt transmitter, and 10 heavy canisters of batteries, designed to measure temperature, wind, and pressure and broadcast them automatically on a schedule for months, with no human being present at all. A weather station that needed no men to survive the Arctic winter because it had no men to lose. Aboard the submarine to install it were the meteorologist Dr. Kurt Sommermeier, after whom the machine was named, and his assistant Walter Hildebrandt. The voyage nearly ended before it began. In the North Atlantic, U-537 was caught in a storm so violent that a single enormous wave smashed across her, tore away her anti-aircraft cannon, and opened a leak in her hull. She arrived off the coast of Canada, unable to dive and unable to defend herself from the air, a damaged submarine on the surface, in enemy waters, carrying a secret she could not afford to lose. On October 22, 1943, she dropped anchor in Martin Bay at the far northern tip of the Labrador Peninsula near Cape Chidley. It was one of the most remote, least inhabited stretches of coastline in North America. Schroe had chosen it precisely because the chance of discovery there was almost nil, though even there, the local Inuit hunted and the Germans worked fast. For the next 28 hours, the crew hauled the components ashore in rubber rafts, manhandled the 220-pound battery canisters up a hill roughly a quarter-mile inland, and assembled Kurt on a 170-foot rise overlooking the bay. And then they did something that reveals exactly how seriously the Germans took the secrecy of the weather war. They disguised the station. They labeled its canisters with the markings of a fictitious organization, the Canadian Meteor Service, a company that did not exist, so that anyone who stumbled upon it would assume it was a harmless Canadian installation. They scattered empty American cigarette packets around the site to reinforce the impression. They were betting that a confused soldier or hunter who found a strange unattended weather station marked with a Canadian-sounding name would shrug, assume it belonged to someone, and leave it alone. By the evening of October 23rd, Kurt was operational and transmitting. U-537 weighed anchor and headed home, fighting off 3 attacks by Canadian aircraft near the Grand Banks of Newfoundland before slipping away. She reached port on December 8th after 70 days at sea. She had completed the only known armed German military operation conducted on the North American mainland in the entire Second World War. And almost no one would know it had happened for 34 years. Kurt transmitted for only about 2 weeks before falling silent. No one is certain why. The batteries may have failed in the cold, the signal may have been jammed or simply lost in the noise. There is no record of the Allies ever detecting it, locating it, or shutting it down. They never found it. The war ended, the world moved on, and Kurt sat on its Labrador hilltop in the silence and the snow year after year, a Nazi installation on North American soil that no living person remembered existed. The witnesses to its installation could not tell anyone. U-537 was lost with all hands in the Java Sea in November 1944. Every man who had stood on that Labrador hill in October 1943 died at the bottom of an ocean on the other side of the planet. Kurt was rediscovered by accident in July 1977 when a geomorphologist named Peter Johnson, surveying the Labrador coast, came across the strange remains of an old weather station and could not work out what it was. It took historians working from the recovered log of U-537 to confirm what he had found. The station was eventually recovered and is now held by the Canadian War Museum, the physical proof of the war that almost no one knew had reached their shores. But the single story that most completely captures the character of the weather war did not happen in Greenland or on the coast of Canada. It happened on a rock at the opposite edge of the Arctic, Alexandra Land, at the far northwestern end of the Franz Josef Land archipelago, roughly 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, deep inside Soviet territory. The station there was codenamed Schatzgräber, treasure hunter. Its construction had been ordered at the highest level of the German command, and it came into operation in September 1943. Like the others, it was put ashore and supplied by submarine, escorted from Kiel by way of Narvik and Tromsø by the U-boat U-387, whose crew helped unload and assemble the equipment on the ice. By the 17th of November, the station was reporting. When the polar night finally lifted, the meteorologists added balloon soundings of the high-altitude winds, the jet stream currents that steer the weather of the entire hemisphere, and went on transmitting faithfully, report after report, more than 700 of them in all. By every standard of the weather war, Schatzgräber was a complete success, and then it was destroyed by a polar bear. By the late spring of 1944, the station's supplies had run low, some had been lost on the way in, and the men were starved for fresh meat. On the 30th of May, two of them, a weather inspector named Gerhard Wallick and a corporal named Werner Blankenberg, hunted and killed a polar bear. The team ate it. They did not cook it through, and they had no way to examine the meat first, which in the Arctic is a fatal kind of carelessness, because polar bear flesh routinely carries the larvae of a parasite called trichinella. Within days, the men of Schatzgräber began to fall ill. Fever, swelling, muscle pain so severe the body seems to turn against itself. Within a month, nearly the entire crew was sick. The only man untouched was the unit's paramedic, Gerhard Hoffmann, for a reason that reads like something out of a fable. He was a vegetarian and had not touched the bear. Picture the situation. A weather station 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, its entire crew incapacitated by a parasite from an animal they had eaten to survive, in a place no relief column could ever reach across the ice. The Navy's doctors diagnosed the illness by radio and ordered an immediate evacuation, and what followed was one of the most improbable rescues of the entire war. A naval surgeon, Dr. Wendt, was to be flown to the island and parachuted in. The aircraft was a 4-engine Focke-Wulf Condor that had already been used to airdrop supplies to the station. It set out in early July 1944 with the doctor aboard. But the pilot, against the plan, tried to land on Alexandra Land, and the Condor was damaged on the ground, stranding the rescuers alongside the men they had come to save. The repair parts had to be flown to the Arctic separately, aboard one of the largest aircraft Germany possessed, a giant Blohm und Voss flying boat that lifted off from the Bay of Biscay on the coast of occupied France, staged north through Norway, and crossed to a single broken aircraft near the top of the world. The Condor was repaired on the ice. On the 11th of July 1944, the whole party, the sick weathermen, the doctor, the air crews, lifted off from Alexandra Land and reached Norway. Schatzgräber was abandoned exactly where it stood. They left something behind them in the snow. To protect the station, the Germans had laid a minefield around it, and in the chaos of the evacuation, they could not clear it. The mines stayed in the Arctic for nearly half a century. When German veterans learned in the 1950s that the Soviet Union had built its own station on the very same island, they tried to send word of where the minefield lay and were ignored. Not until 1990 did a Norwegian expedition, working from the original German maps the weather troops had drawn in 1943, finally locate and disarm them. The remains of the station itself, rusted tins, instruments, the debris of a year at the edge of the world, were surveyed and catalogued only in 2016. Hundreds of objects carried south to a museum. The physical residue of a war fought with thermometers and radio sets on an island almost no human being has ever walked. Step back from the individual stations and look at the shape of the whole thing, and the weather war begins to feel less like a campaign than a kind of haunting. There were no battles in the ordinary sense. Holzauge cost one life, Kurt cost none, until its installers died elsewhere. Schatzgräber was undone not by a bullet, but by a meal. The men who fought this war were not killed by enemy fire. They were killed, when they were killed at all, by the place itself. By cold that froze flesh in minutes, by the dark, by a parasite in a bear, by isolation that lasted not days, but seasons. The enemy in the weather war was rarely another soldier. The enemy was the Arctic. And the Arctic does not negotiate. A man on Nordostlandet or Sabine Island in midwinter lived inside a problem that had nothing to do with ideology or nationhood. He needed fuel or he froze. He needed his radio to work or his entire purpose evaporated. He could not leave. There were no roads, no relief, no retreat. If the supply ship did not come, no one was coming. He was as alone as it is possible for a human being to be and still be at war. This produced a particular kind of psychological weight, documented in the diaries and memoirs that survived. It was not the fear of combat, it was the fear of the indifferent. The men of these stations described the specific dread of the polar night, weeks and then months without sunrise, the sun simply gone, the world reduced to the circle of light around a lamp and the endless dark beyond it. They described the way the mind behaves when there is nothing to see and nothing to fight and no way out. The way time stops, meaning anything. The way the silence presses. And they were soldiers fighting a war made entirely of numbers. There was no glory available to them, no charge to lead, no position to take, no medal that fit what they did. They read instruments and transmitted figures into the void. A man could spend an entire winter at one of these stations and never once experience anything that looked like the war he had imagined when he enlisted. He fought, and the only thing he ever faced was the weather, and the only weapon he ever used was a radio, and the only territory he ever held was a rock no one else wanted. It is worth holding on to how strange that is. The most consequential thing these men did, the readings that flowed back to German command and shaped the timing of operations across an ocean, was the most invisible thing they did. They never saw the result. The radio operator on Sabine Island who transmitted a pressure reading on a January morning had no way of knowing whether that reading helped route a U-boat or time a raid or simply vanished into a forecaster's discarded notes. He sent the numbers into the dark, and the dark gave nothing back. Which brings us to the last station, and the loneliest, and the one whose story would end longest after everyone else had stopped fighting. In late August 1944, a German expedition sailed from Narvik in occupied Norway, bound for the most remote and northerly of the main islands of the Svalbard archipelago, Nordostlandet, a wilderness of glaciers and snow-covered peaks deep inside the Arctic Ocean. A submarine and the converted trawler Carl J. Bush carried 11 men and their equipment north, then turned and ran for Norway before they could be spotted by Allied warships. The expedition was codenamed Haudegen. It would be the last German weather station of the war, and its commander was a man unlike most who fought in it. Lieutenant Dr. Wilhelm Dege, a geographer by training, a scientist sent to do science in a war that had no place for it. The 11 men under him had been put through extraordinary training before they came north. They had learned to ski and to climb and to rappel down ice cliffs, to build igloos, to cook and bake from scratch, to pull teeth and treat gunshot wounds, and, if it came to it, to amputate frozen limbs. They came prepared to be entirely on their own, because they were going to be entirely on their own. They reached Fjorden in mid-September and went to work. They built 2 low, flat-roofed huts and camouflaged them with white netting. By the 14th of September, they were transmitting. The routine of Haudegen settled into place. Encrypted weather reports sent south to the German Naval Command at Tromsø 5 times a day, and once a week a hydrogen-filled balloon released into the dark and tracked as it climbed to 8,000 meters, reading the upper atmosphere where Europe's weather was made. The rest was survival. The polar night swallowed Nordostlandet for over 2 months. Temperatures fell to -40. Polar bears moved through the dark around the huts, and the men learned never to step outside alone or unarmed. To fill the endless hours, Dege, who was, after all, a teacher at heart, gave his men lessons in science, geography, mathematics, and philosophy. They built a sauna from salvaged materials. They celebrated Christmas in 1944 on a rock at the top of the world, 11 men and a wireless set and the dark. And every day, on schedule, they read the sky they could not see and sent the numbers south. They never saw an Allied soldier. No one ever attacked them. The war that consumed the rest of the planet simply never arrived at Nordostlandet, which is what made what happened next so cruel. To understand why those numbers mattered, why Germany spent submarines and lives putting men on rocks in the dark, you have to look at one morning in June 1944, while Dege's men were still being trained for a station they had not yet built. By the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The cross-channel assault on Normandy required a near-impossible alignment of conditions. A low tide at dawn, enough moonlight for the airborne drops the night before, light winds, low seas, and clear enough skies. Get it wrong, and thousands of men would drown before they reached the sand. Gliders would scatter, naval gunfire would miss, and the whole enterprise could collapse on the beach. The decision of when to launch came down, in the end, to a weather forecast. The Allied forecasting effort was led by a Royal Air Force officer, Group Captain James Stagg. And Stagg had something his German counterparts did not: the upstream picture. The Allied network, the stations across Canada, Greenland and Iceland, the weather ships, the long-range flights over the North Atlantic, let his team watch the weather being born in the west and march east toward the Channel. They saw a powerful storm bearing down on the invasion area for the planned date of June 5th, and, crucially, in the data streaming. In from the far western edge of their network, including a critical rise in pressure reported off the west coast of Ireland, they saw something the storm was hiding behind it: a brief, narrow break. A window of barely tolerable conditions opening over Normandy on June 6th and likely closing again soon after. On the strength of that forecast, Eisenhower made the most consequential weather decision in military history. He postponed the assault from the 5th, held tens of thousands of men in agonizing readiness for one more day, and then, in the small hours, gave the order to go. He launched into the window Stagg's team had seen coming from the west. He later wrote that landing on the 5th, as originally planned, would have been a major disaster. And the Germans? The German forecasters saw the same storm. They were good at their work, and the storm was real, and they predicted it correctly. But working without the western half of the map, without the upstream stations, the Allies had spent years denying them, and that Germany had spent submarines and lives trying to replace on Arctic rocks. Their reading of what came after the storm was thinner, later, and more uncertain. Their assessment was that the bad weather would persist, that the seas would stay too rough for any landing, and that an invasion in the coming days was effectively impossible. They relaxed. Senior officers left their coastal commands for war games inland. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the defense of exactly the coast the Allies were about to assault, judged the weather safe enough to drive home to Germany and present his wife with a pair of shoes for her birthday. This is the payoff of the entire weather war, and it is why this obscure campaign of frozen rocks and dog sleds belongs in the same sentence as Normandy. The brilliance of the Allied D-Day forecast did not come from nowhere. It came from owning the source, from the structural advantage of holding the western stations, the place the weather is born, the place Germany could never reach with anything more than a handful of desperate men on the ice. The asymmetry that the Germans were trying to close at Holzhauge and Kurt and Haudegen, the asymmetry between knowing what tomorrow's sky will do and merely guessing, is the asymmetry that helped catch the defenders of Normandy looking the wrong way on the most important morning of the war. The men freezing on Nordaustlandet never knew any of this. They could not have known it. They were transmitting their numbers into the same dark that, on the other side of the equation, had already decided the fate of an invasion they would only hear about long after it was over. On the 8th of May, 1945, the radio at Haudegen received its final message from Tromsø. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The message instructed the men to stop transmitting, to go silent, to avoid being detected by Allied forces now controlling the Norwegian coast. Dege gave the order. The numbers stopped. And then the 11 men of Operation Haudegen sat on their rock at the top of the world and confronted a situation that no one in the German command had planned for, because no one in the German command was thinking about them at all. They had been forgotten. The war was over and no one was coming for them. Their command structure had ceased to exist. The supply ship that was supposed to return for them belonged to a navy that had surrendered. They had finished their mission. They wanted, more than anything, to go home and find out whether their families and their country still existed in any form. And there was no way to do it except to ask their enemies to come and take them prisoner. So they tried. They lost their radio contact in May. Through the summer, they attempted to reach someone, anyone, and only in August were they able to broadcast a call for help, sending distress signals on the frequencies the Allies used, asking, in effect, to be captured. Dege, ever the optimist, ever the scientist, reassured his men with a line that has survived him. The crew of a weather station, he said, can hardly be considered war criminals. On September 2nd, 1945, on the far side of the planet, Japan formally surrendered and the Second World War ended. 2 days later, on September 4th, a Norwegian seal hunting vessel commanded by a captain named Ludvig Albertsen reached Nordaustlandet and took the 11 Germans aboard. Wilhelm Dege drew his Luger pistol and handed it to the Norwegian captain. A formal surrender, soldier to soldier, in a place no soldier had ever attacked. A surrender document was drawn up and signed. With that signature, the men of Operation Haudegen became the last German military unit anywhere on Earth to surrender in the Second World War, nearly 4 months after Germany itself had capitulated, and after even Japan had laid down its arms. They were taken to Tromsø and held as prisoners of war for 3 months. In December 1945, they went home to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they had left. The country was divided. Some of the 11 found themselves in the west and some in the east, and as the years hardened the line between the two, the friendships forged in the polar night became almost impossible to maintain. They had survived the Arctic together. The peace pulled them apart. The youngest of them, a man named Siegfried Chapka, lived until August 2015, outlasting not only the war but the Cold War, the division of his country, and the Soviet Union itself. The huts they built still stand on Nordaustlandet. The Norwegian state preserves them as historical heritage. They sit empty on the ice, flat-roofed and weathered, in the place where 11 men once read a sky they could not see and sent its numbers into a dark that had already stopped listening. The weather war never produced a hero anyone could put on a poster. It produced no decisive battle, no famous charge, no moment a film could end on. It was fought by meteorologists and trappers and radio operators, in places without names, over a resource that cannot be captured because it cannot be held. You can take a city, you can take a hill, you cannot take the weather. You can only know it sooner than the other man, and knowing it sooner, it turned out, was worth submarines and lives and the loneliest deployments of the entire war. Wilhelm Dege wrote a book about it afterward, the way Colonel Dolgenkov had filled a diary in the forests of Finland. He titled it, in German, "Trapped in Arctic Ice." He had gone to the top of the world to read the sky, and he had stayed there until everyone who sent him had stopped fighting, and then a little longer, because no one remembered he was there. Remember the one fact that started all of this. In the North Atlantic, the weather comes from the west. The storm that closes the channel is born over Labrador. The clear dawn that opens over a beach in Normandy is forming tonight over empty Greenland ice. The future arrives from the west, and the whole of this strange, frozen, forgotten war was an attempt by both sides to stand far enough west to see it coming. The Allies got there first. They held the source, and on one morning in June, the few hours of clear weather that they saw arriving from the west and that the Germans did not see clearly enough was the difference between a continent liberated and a continent that stayed in the dark a while longer. 11 men sat on a rock and read that same sky and never knew what it had already decided. They were not heroes and they were not villains. They were men sent to the coldest, darkest, emptiest edge of the world to do something that no one watching the visible war would ever notice. And they did it faithfully into a silence that gave them nothing back. The weather comes from the west. It always has. And for a few years in the middle of the 20th century, men froze and died and were forgotten on the rocks where it was born, trying to be the first to know what tomorrow's sky would do. If this is the kind of forgotten history you come here for, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely keeps these stories alive. We dig up stories like this one every single week. And here's the question I want to put to you in the comments. Picture yourself as one of those 11 men on Nordaustlandet in the summer of 1945. The war is over. No one is coming. You are sending numbers into a dark that has stopped answering, with no idea whether your home, your family, or even your country still exists. Would you have kept transmitting? And honestly, what do you think would have kept you sane through a winter of total darkness with 10 other men and no way out? Tell us below. We read them. Now watch this next one. There's another Arctic story that almost no one knows, and what these men found out on the ice is even harder to believe.